Hello, everyone. I'm excited to do my presentation today for CRC 23, which is entitled Yu-Gi-Oh! Free Play, perfectly in line with the conference's theme. So I was super excited and I was like, I have to do this. So yeah, without further ado, I guess I'll talk a little bit about myself first. I'm a PhD student at North Carolina State University, as are the other people on my panel. And so I also did my master's at NC State. I studied the local Super Smash Bros. Community by doing an ethnography. So I kind of have a background in studying esports, and I was able to teach game studies last fall. So that's where the Yu-Gi-Oh comes in. Um, so yeah, here's the catalog description for game studies. So kind of the dry version. Um, sorry, yeah, the dry version, basically an exploration of the social and cultural significance of digital games, an overview of major approaches and theories used in studies of digital play. Basically, we're going to talk about games, is what it says. So students thought that that was kind of what they were getting into, but instead what I gave them was kind of Yu-Gi-Oh! The class. So I asked to teach Monday, Wednesday, Fridays, so that I would have the opportunity to devote one of those days each week to Yu-Gi-Oh, which was Friday. So we would do like kind of a normal lecture on Mondays in class where I would talk about whatever the article was for the week. And then on Wednesdays, we'd kind of have more of a discussion. And then Fridays would be Yu-Gi-Oh! And they would get packs and cards and stuff throughout the semester. Obviously, I'll explain this more in depth as I go. But yeah, that's kind of the very basic overview. So the pedagogical background or whatever for all of this, I draw a lot of inspiration from John Dewey in the idea of learning from experience. John Dewey being huge in the field of art, but also the field of education, basically being kind of the father of compulsory education in the United States. Basically the reason that we have K-12 education, elementary school, stuff like that in the way that we currently understand it, all comes from him. And, yeah, he basically thought that by doing stuff, you could learn from doing that. And so it's kind of impossible to replicate what you can learn from playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Over the course of a semester in an inorganic way, or it's kind of impossible to rush it. So since I kind of had the opportunity to do this, I was like, all right, I'm going to take the opportunity. Um, and I would say that it worked decently well, so that's why I'm here to talk about it. Sorry that I think my head is blocking the title for the first time, but this says Teaching Philosophy, Learning from Reflection. So, like a lot of folks, perhaps, I was tasked with creating a teaching philosophy in one of my pedagogy classes, and it was basically the idea of learning from failure, or learning from consciously reflecting on what went right or wrong in any given scenario. This being born out of largely the ethos of skateboarding, and falling 11 times in a row and getting up a 12th time and then maybe getting it on that 12th time based on what you've learned from the 11 failures before that, basically. And this is something that Rodney Mullen, who's kind of the father of a lot of the skateboarding tricks. If people are not familiar with skateboarding, he's probably invented every trick that you've heard of, type guy. Who's done TED Talks talking about this exact concept, basically learning from failure and how like failing's not bad as long as you're willing to keep trying, because that's where learning comes from a lot of the time. So that was hard to get students to accept in practice in the class, as I'll talk about later. But yeah, that's kind of the pedagogical background or the philosophical background behind stuff. So a way one of my students summed up the course is that it is throughout the course, we were asked to engage in a long-term experiential learning experience in which we gain firsthand insight into learning a new game, the process of trial and error, rule negotiation, and idea formation across different platforms and mediums. So, like I was saying, the idea of learning from what's going right and wrong in their games, and that being just a different type of learning than typically goes into a college classroom. Rule negotiation, meaning that I was going to leave it open to them to ban certain cards if they wanted to. Yeah, and then the idea of different platforms affecting it differently. There's tons of different ways to play Yu-Gi-Oh! physically on the tabletop, or a plethora of different apps and video games across the years. So yeah, they experience different platforms and the ways in which those reshape the experience of playing. One of the major ways being that when you play on the digital platforms, since it handles a lot of the rules for you, you like can't be wrong. So you can't have that experience of doing things wrong and then having people correct you. So the very first thing I did when I started the class was ask people what their past relationship with Yu-Gi-Oh was prior to the class. So anything ranging from they've never heard of it to like they have opinions on relevant cards that are used in tournaments. And almost no one had tournament experience with Yu-Gi-Oh! There were a few Magic players in the class, or people that had maybe been to some level of organized event, like a Toys R Us, Barnes and Noble type thing as a kid. But largely the whole class was, a little bit to my surprise, completely unfamiliar with the actual mechanics of the game. But that was good in a way, because then it was more of an even playing field and people got to have the experience on a more similar level, basically, to one another. So, because I couldn't assume that anyone knew anything about Yu-Gi-Oh, though, I started them off with what is kind of, I thought, the easiest way to get into it, which is an app that was developed, I think it came out in 2016, to do exactly that. It was a very simplified, stripped down version of Yu-Gi-Oh, aimed at getting people who, were not interested in the game anymore, but were 10 or 15 years ago at that time. Back into it. And it definitely worked. The biggest Yu-Gi-Oh YouTuber now, that is his story. He got back into it because of this. But yeah, it's now available for PC and it runs a lot faster on there, which is something that students were able to experience in real time and write about and stuff as well. But in general, it's a simplified version of the game. There's half as many cards in a deck, half as many zones on the field, half as many life points, and a much smaller pool of cards to choose from than the main game, which has over 10,000 at this point. So this, according to students' reflections and stuff, did actually do what it was supposed to in accomplishing teaching them the basics of the game. So yeah, that was a decent success. I think if I guess I was to go back and do this again with more planning, I would have them do this over the summer, or at least encourage it heavily type thing, so that they would have just more of a literacy. Because we basically had to devote the first week of the class to learning Yu-Gi-Oh before we talked about any academic content, which is not necessarily a problem, but some folks may see it that way. All right, so here is the deck that they started off with. So I curated a deck of 15 cards of my choosing that I, honed in on what I thought would be good for new players. They all got an identical deck. So here's the list. Obviously, feel free to pause if you are a fan of the game and want to check out what's going on here. Got some classic stuff like Karibo, Giant Soldier of Stone. But yeah, so some cards that were fairly basic, but that had a lot of examples of different ways that cards interact in the game in this. So yeah, that was their starter deck that they got. Everyone got this on the first day. And then after that, they were able to get booster packs when they did things like turning in assignments or showing up each day for attendance. And these would have more random cards that were not all the same. So that made the experience unique for everyone. That created the opportunity for students to potentially trade cards with one another and simulate that experience. It also gives them the very important experience in playing a trading card game of opening packs and getting something good sometimes or getting something bad other times, etc. So that's probably the proudest part of this, is that I worked with the libraries to get this fancy gold paper and make, actual booster packs for the class, which was pretty cool. Probably the coolest thing that I will ever do. So example of kind of what was in the packs. The reason that this slide exists is because I gave them all the same first 5 packs as well, so that kept things more consistent, and I was able to kind of, guide them on at least somewhat similar paths at the beginning. So that worked out as it was supposed to. They didn't know until I told them actually that they were identical, because they were still somewhat mixed up or whatever, but they all got the same 15 cards across 5 packs. But just to clarify, in case there's any ambiguity, there were like thousands of other cards that they got, or at least had access to. They all got a few hundred over the course of the semester through the booster packs. So this is obviously being positioned as a longitudinal experiential learning experience, which I am quoting Kai once again on. And with that, there is this bracket, a Swiss bracket, which is how Yu-Gi-Oh tournaments are typically ran, meaning that after each round, people play someone that has the same record as them. So that works out decently well in theory, because then people who are losing will play other people who have lost, and they'll be on the same level, or people who have been winning a lot will play other people who have been winning, and they'll get, more quality games or whatever. Because they'll be on the same level, basically. Works out better for everyone. In practice, in a college class where I was telling students they had to probably come to maybe only one class on a Friday just to do this, there were a lot of like no-shows and students getting the win just because of their opponent not showing up, which kind of completely undermined the idea of the Swiss format, causing students to play people with the same record. But it still did obviously give us the longitudinal feel of being able to like make adjustments in response to winning or losing, opposed to if we just played Yu-Gi-Oh one day in class, it would have not been at all a similar experience to this. It would have only been the like, I don't understand what's going on experience that folks will talk about happening at the beginning. As a paratext to the course, I attempted to implement a Discord server where students could talk about strategy or the course readings or trade cards. In practice, it did not end up panning out, and this screenshot is just the very well positioned only 2 trades that even got proposed, basically. But in theory, that could have been a cool paratextual resource. I think that if I would have somehow incentivized the use of it more, then it could have been used more. But I'm not necessarily upset with that. It was kind of like the entire experiment in that whatever way that it was used is an appropriate way to use it. But it was supposed to be a simulation of how, when you're playing a card game in real life, there are YouTube videos and Discord servers and stuff that you would in theory be a part of. So the idea of this being a community thing was a big deal. Like the class being a community or becoming one. So now we're reaching the point of student testimonies, and there's a lot of words on the slides. So we got this little GIF of Yugi in the corner that's being cut off, it looks like, anyway, just to give us something interesting to look at. But yeah, one of the biggest struggles is getting the students to accept that it was okay not to know things. So Kai here is saying that she did not enjoy the process of learning new things because she doesn't like kind of understanding what she's supposed to do but not being able to do it yet. And it was not until she accepted her status as a new player that she could enjoy the process. And it's cool, obviously, to see students kind of having the ups and downs and the experiences that I was predicting they may have. And yeah, actually having them. But that was definitely a struggle with a lot of the students, and I think a reason that the Discord did not get used as much for trading, which people were very explicit about, and Kai even says in this quote, is that they were scared to like get ripped off, basically. Which I was kind of like, darn, because that was kind of supposed to be almost a rite of passage and an experience that was totally okay to have and just something that you could then write about regretting. But instead, everyone gravitated towards actively not wanting to have that happen to them, which is interesting. All right, so also Kai talked about learning as a community and how without the solidarity of her classmates who were also fairly new to the game, she wouldn't have stuck with the game to even form an opinion on it. And as TL Taylor and Emma Kautsky have said, the mistakes we make are what connect us as gamers. So yeah, the theory crafting and the between the match talking about games are a huge part about playing games that the longitudinal unit allowed the students to have access to. And one of my other students, Miles, said a similar thing, basically, that he made, real friends through this, which is something that is a typical experience of, gaming communities that's happened within the Smash community that I've studied as well. Yeah, and then I've seen like these students, both of them have taken another class with me and they are friends. So that's cool to see. Winning is not the point, if that's not obvious. So one of my students, Ethan, who had apparently never even heard of Yu-Gi-Oh prior to the class, said, I sucked at the game. That's the simple truth, but make no mistake, I had a blast, but I did not perform. So that said, most of his reflections were still about strategizing new ways to improve. So he was still doing a ton of thinking and kind of growing, but perhaps his peers were at a similar rate. And yeah, so winning is not the point, basically, is kind of what we're getting at here, if that's not obvious. It's more about trial, error, and then eventually, hypothetically, success. So another one of my students, Lagan, talking about how on week 4, they finally took the time to read all of their cards, which is kind of a rite of passage in Yu-Gi-Oh! They even make sleeves that say, like, read the card, because folks are infamous for not doing that. But yeah, and then that changed the game for them. They were able to begin kind of the process that, like Ethan was talking about, of theory crafting and basically growing. And they went on a big win streak after this week as well for like 5 weeks. So the trial, error, and success method of teaching was playing out there. Another one of my students, Maddie, talked about the idea of like Yugioh muscles and building them up. She started out with like a week or like no level as a baseline, other than being able to, read and follow directions, so she could use the cards in that way. But basically over the course of the semester, she had to build up the endurance to, use the stronger Yu-Gi-Oh muscles, essentially. And that was, I thought, a really interesting way to put it. And again, an articulation of basically the class working how it was supposed to, and the students are getting something out of it, which was basically the goal. There was a lot of folks that talked about it being a surprisingly social experience and how they thought that Yu-Gi-Oh is like a nerdy hobby, which is perhaps true. There is actually explicit rules from the company that runs the game for regional and higher level events about hygiene, and you can be disqualified for what you smell like in this community. But yes, it takes a considerable amount of extroversion to engage with physical Yu-Gi-Oh! And Lagan was very vocal about how they did not like having to do this one-on-one in-person thing, which is obviously a valid interpretation of all of the experiences. And I guess, like, I'm sorry for doing that to them. But Miles expressed similar sentiments to the idea of it being surprisingly social, just in that, yeah, like, it's a really social game, even though people may or may not be nerds who are into it. Perhaps there was too much freedom in that I was basically just like, whatever you get out of this is what you get out of it. And folks who are stricter than I pedagogically may be cringing at all of this. But basically, no, it didn't end up playing out like that. People definitely got stuff out of it, as I hoped. And this is kind of just like a trick slide to suggest that perhaps it didn't go as well as it actually did. That said, there were definitely some flaws in the course, and people gained cards way too fast to actually consciously make adjustments. I should have perhaps limited the card pool more, but I certainly got overzealous when I got the opportunity to do this and bought way too many cards in order to make this happen. So that is something that I would change if I was doing it again, because then students could perhaps have more coherent growth. All right, and I think my last slide here is a quote from Angel talking about how he was surprised that people didn't keep their cards, as many people. A lot of people gave me back their cards at the end of the class. And I also was surprised because I'm fascinated by, the power that we, I guess, embed in these objects, basically, in the stories that they have and all of that. So I was glad to see at least one of my students appreciating that and explicitly talking about it. So yeah, students definitely got something out of the course, even if only the physical cards they took home with them. And real quick, I want to give a shout out to the folks that were able to make this happen financially. Real Good Deal is a fairly big TCG distributor or whatever, and they gave me a bunch of game boards for my students to play on. TCG Player Direct is just kind of like an eBay type cards source, and they were able to sell me cards with free shipping, like for like 1 cent a piece, a bunch, and it would have been absolutely impossible without them. And they also gave me store credit directly towards the class. NCSU Libraries gave me the paper for the packs and stuff. And then Konami Sad Boy is someone on Instagram and YouTube and stuff who donated sleeves for the students. So yes, thank you all for watching. I'm really sorry if I went over on time. Yeah, I'll be excited to see if there's any questions. And bye.